So it's my great honour to introduce my guest today. It's Simon Kemp. And Simon is a man of many talents, I'm going to say. He's been a thought leader globally in the space of digital marketing, and he's worked with some worldwide brands like Google, Nestle, Coca-Cola, and you're continuing to work as a marketing consultant as well, Simon, is that right?
Yeah, so the majority of our work now is briefings rather than consultancy, but still traveling the world speaking to lots of different kinds of organizations.
Brilliant. You've also got your own business, so the founder and CEO of Kepios,
Yes.
and chief analyst, as well as, which I really like, a music producer and DJ recording your first album. So
Yeah, this is an ongoing thing. To be honest, it will probably never be finished as a first album, but let's keep it there as a nice little piece of story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that gives us a really good sense of who you are, man of jack of all trades, really, is what I'm kind of getting from that.
Yep.
But what connected us essentially originally was this passion that we both share and around future of work and sharing what we're doing in that space. So I purposely didn't want to introduce too much so that I took away your gold. But in terms of, I guess, even with us connecting in this way, where are you located today?
So today I'm in Singapore. We've just finished a 120-day world tour, which was a little bit crazy. So it's very nice to be back in my home office here.
Yes.
But yeah, so we're based in Singapore, but we do spend an awful lot of time traveling around the world. We actually just spent some time down in your corner of the globe a couple of weeks ago. Hopefully back again soon. But yeah, all the stuff that we'll be discussing today will be informed by perspectives from all around the world. So hopefully a very international perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love that. So in terms of the future of work, what are you experiencing to be some of the top innovations or changes in either your industry or in the marketplace?
So technology is my special area of focus, what people are doing on the internet. So Kepios spends a lot of time collecting and analyzing data around audience behaviors. So we're less interested perhaps in what companies are doing on their digital roadmap, and we're much more interested in what the audiences that use those companies' tools and services are doing. Mm-hmm. So we produce a massive series of studies in partnership with Hootsuite and We Are Social called the Global Digital Reports. These come out every quarter with then an annual update on what people are doing at a local level for every country in the world. That was a bit of a long setup to tell you what we're seeing in the data. So the stuff I'm going to share with you probably through the course of our conversation comes from the insights that we pull out of that data. Some of the stuff that I'm most interested in at the moment is the way that people take digital tools that have been designed for one particular purpose and then adapt, if you like, or repurpose those tools and those services for their own specific needs. And I think some of the most interesting things when you look at the future of work perspective, how people are using things like social media, things like voice control, all these kinds of connected technologies to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of their work, but also to work in very different ways. So it seems that both of us today are working from home. This is obviously an increasing trend around the world that is made possible by technology. The fact that we're doing this conversation by video chat, so through the excellent Zoom platform, that kind of stuff is changing the way that people around the world are doing all sorts of different kinds of work, whether it's remote working, whether it is outsourcing to another part of the world. So those are some of the headline trends. I'm guessing you're going to have some specific questions and I'm in danger of rambling. So I'll let you dig into which one of those which ones you find most interesting.
Yeah, so some of that data, so is that something that's been captured across different industries, or are you sort of focusing on particular industries for that data, or how's that come about?
No, so we collect it based on the individual behaviors, if you like. So we don't necessarily break our data down into professional industries, if you like. Sure. We'll break it down into a way that people use that data from a personal, use those services and platforms from a personal perspective. So when we're looking at things like LinkedIn use, we'll look at the number of people that use LinkedIn or the number of people that you can target with LinkedIn advertising. But we're not going to break that down and say this person is always and forever going to be an advertising executive, because importantly, people shift through their careers, and it's much more interesting from my perspective to be tracking the individual and what they do. Obviously, being able to break that down by industry is important, but if we treat our audiences, if we treat our employees always as human beings and start from their life, then it's much easier for us to sort of join that Venn diagram. I'm trying desperately to draw one on the video screen here. If you sort of think about that Venn diagram between what the employer is trying to achieve, what the individual is trying to achieve, where those two things overlap is where happiness and success come from.
Great. And are you seeing some common trends in people's behavior when it comes to how they want to work or how they're looking for work and things like that?
So this varies quite a lot by culture. I think this is one of the really interesting things. So I think when you look at some of the important shifts in behavior around the world, you'll see that the fine line between the work and the life elements of that famous work-life balance, they're beginning to blur. In some instances, that's a very positive thing driven by the individual. In some cases, that's quite a negative thing that is being driven by increased competition and demand from employers. And I think understanding where that sits is going to be a very subjective issue. So what I like and what you like when it comes to that work-life balance is probably going to be quite different. But overall, we're seeing an increased use in things, especially like social media, for people to achieve things as part of their ongoing work, whether that's during work hours as part of their sort of job description, right the way through to doing things outside of work or sort of in parallel with their work, where they're building a reputation as a thought leader, where they're engaging in conversations around the sort of areas in which they work as part of just their general interest. That's something that we're seeing starting to break through. So it's relatively well established for people who work in professional services companies in what you might want to call the developed markets. So in places like the US and Europe and Australia, and to a certain extent also in Japan, although much less so, we're seeing people getting involved in conversations around their industries, if you like, so the things that they work in, or even parallel things that they're interested in. It's beginning to come through in some of the developing economies, especially around places like Southeast Asia, where we see the highest levels of use of social media for work purposes on an individual basis, which I find fascinating. So places like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, we're seeing really strong growth in using social media for work purposes, but on an individual basis. So this is not necessarily as part of your job description. This is just something that you've decided to get engaged with as an individual. So that kind of stuff fascinates me because, as I said, it starts to blur the lines between work and life. And the idea that you're separating those two things out, I think that's where it starts to get dangerous. If you're coming home from work and you desperately want to switch off from your work, then I totally understand that. I remember that. But I think it is increasingly going to be quite difficult as we look at a globalized workforce that is spread around the world. Competition for the best jobs and opportunities is increasing, and there's increasingly less barriers, or fewer barriers rather, for people anywhere in the world to take on those roles and to deliver value. So it's going to get more competitive.
Yeah, 100% agree. It's interesting that you say that about some of those countries because I'm not sure if you're aware, but part of my background is in offshoring, specifically with the Philippines. But I'm from Australia, right. In Australia, a lot of the clients sit in the Australasia region, so to speak, but also, looking at what the workforce is doing in spaces of the BPO industry have always been something of interest. And to your point, I've been a real advocate for businesses in Australia or in different countries to open their workforce or their recruitment strategies to look at, because we have the technology and the capability to do so, talent across the board, because there is a talent shortage in some areas specifically, but generally it's just increasing everywhere. And like to your point, the fact that people are trying to make themselves more accessible because, it is competitive. So we are all trying to, position ourselves and essentially create our own brands. That work-life balance, or essentially work-life integration, and just having balance in life is, an interesting thing, because even for me personally, I've definitely felt that. Have you seen that has also changed from a company or an organizational point of view, or is it more just individuals?
So I don't track the company data as much, but certainly anecdotally and qualitatively from the kinds of conversations that we have with organizations all around the world, I think increasingly employers are aware of this. And what's quite interesting is that HR teams, human capital teams, whatever you want to call them, they're often the sorts of people that will start these kinds of activities themselves as well. So from what I've seen, a lot of people that work in human capital are some of the first to be working from home and that kind of stuff to try these things out. So they're aware of it on an individual basis, but it often takes a lot longer for that to be integrated, certainly from a structured perspective, into organizational ways of working, if you like. So what's quite interesting is, once again, we're seeing the individual having a heightened sense of potential in technology, and that often leads the organizational ability to integrate that back into the business. So we've still got quite a strong difference between what individuals are able to do and are interested in doing versus what is acceptable at an organizational level. So there's a bit of a gap there. And I think part of that may be because it takes a long time for especially older leadership, and I don't mean that in any way judgmentally, but as somebody who is progressing in years myself, I've started to be aware that the older you get, the longer it takes you to assimilate technology into your life. I look at some of the new social platforms coming through, can't make sense of them, can't get my head around it. So, you know, if you've had a way of working that's been there for your entire career, it's very difficult to suddenly change overnight and to integrate that across especially large organizations. So I don't think, it's probably not fair to judge on that one and say companies are slower than individuals.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's what the data shows us. And I think we've got to be careful also of forcing all individuals within an organization to embrace technology and to work in different ways. Some people want a very clear separation between office and home life. And as employers, I think we're going to have to respect those barriers and those sort of dividing lines, if you like, and make sure that we're using this technology to everybody's benefit and not just satisfying the very sort of early adopters of new technology. I think when you start looking at things like Uber as well, I know that Uber always is a sensitive topic when it comes to employment conversations, but I think it's really interesting when you look at that as, let's look at it as an opportunity first. If you want to discuss the challenges, we can get into that later. But if you look at it from an opportunity perspective, the sort of the chance now for people to work on their own terms at times of the day that suits their broader life cycle and schedule, I think that kind of stuff is really, really interesting. And we're seeing increasing amounts of sort of ability to flex, if you like, thanks to technology, whether it is in doing stuff late at night because you put your young kids to bed, whether it's working early in the morning because that's just the way that your body clock runs, that kind of stuff. Office hours, I suppose, are becoming an increasingly flexible idea.
Yes.
Once you're into international working, that's only a good thing. I mean, I'm sure living in Australia, you suffer the eternal battle of trying to talk with people on the other side of the world where you just can never sync a time zone when you're both at work officially. So yeah, I mean, I'm seeing all sorts of very positive things around this. I'm aware that I'm lucky because I'm already in that stage where because I run my own business, I can define what my working hours are. And I'm aware that it's not the same for everybody. But at the same time, I like to look at the positive sides of the angle. This is improving opportunities.
Yeah, definitely. So knowing that, do you have advice or frameworks that help, or have you seen things that have really allowed or enabled companies to really embrace this agile workforce with where time zones, locations are all, they're not criteria in terms of how they attract talent? Because I know that as employers or as people that are consultants supporting businesses, that's a real challenge. Is they all understand that this is the future of work and they want to embrace it, but then the actual reality of implementing it or integrating it to the way they work is not as easy. So have you seen certain companies or certain people do it well when they have been trying to integrate this new way of working?
So I'll be honest, I've never found a catch-all solution for this. There is no one-size-fits-all strategy that is going to work for every company. And my personal experience has been that the smaller the company, the easier it is because you need to cater for fewer individuals. And I think it's that bit that is the very clear learning. Every time I get involved in a conversation about building in more agile sort of ways of working and especially remote working, it's always down to individuals and their perspectives rather than what can the technology do. So the technology is simply enablers of the stuff that you care about as an organization and as an individual. And I think a lot of the time we try and force fit current ways of working into sort of a new technological reality. That is usually the cause. Sorry, can't speak. That's usually the cause of where the pain points lie. Instead of trying to take an old model and adapt it to a new reality, the thing that I see being most successful with some of the companies I've worked with is you rewind right the way back to the beginning of the process. What is the outcome that as a business you're looking for? Is it better integration of globally dispersed teams? Is it more flexibility for individual workers? And inevitably, you're going to have a whole bunch of different things that you're trying to achieve, but understanding what the most important objectives from an organizational perspective are and writing those down, being very clear about them. And then also looking at it from this sort of the employer brand perspective. What are the things that you want to offer potential and existing employees? What are the opportunities around this sort of more technologically driven ways of working? How can you then align those two things? And that's going to vary considerably by industry, by individual, and by culture of the company as well. I think this is one that maybe gets overlooked quite a lot when we talk about technology, is you've got to understand how the values of your company work when you're looking at it from a technological perspective. If you've got a very sort of sociable team, if people are sort of very keen to spend time with their colleagues, even if it's outside of work hours, then weaving that into the way that you harness technology is a very important fact, because you may think that promoting this dispersed agile approach is a really good thing, but what happens if your team actually just like being physically present? What if they like having lunch together every day, for example? Those are really important things. And a lot of the time, those are what makes or breaks a team. And the danger is that by overly embracing technology, sometimes we can lose some of the more sort of subtle benefits that perhaps were never written into contracts or were never actually a sort of structured part of the way that teams work. And yet there are a lot of what actually creates value. So yeah, that was a very long answer to say it's going to depend massively on the individual specifics of where your company's at and where your team's at.
Yeah, cool. I wouldn't mind exploring a little bit more with you just that concept around culture and organizational culture, because I agree. I actually only the other day went to an event where we started talking, or what we started sharing EX as a concept that's been around, but isn't necessarily it's an emerging area, so to speak. So where traditionally customer experience was always the focus for companies, we're now moving towards what does EX look like? And now again, because we do have the capacity to measure what that could look like, or at least look at some of the behaviors, not necessarily measure satisfaction or whatever in all organizations, but it's a very interesting space for people to explore and look at. Have you had any experience in that, or seen anything in that space, either on an individual or a team basis across some of the work that you've done for clients?
So it's not really an area that I've spent a lot of professional time looking at, if that makes sense. It's not the kind of brief we're receiving yet, and that sort of speaks to the fact, like you said, this is an emerging area. I did do some stuff recently in the Philippines that was looking a little bit more about how you can use things like social media to integrate teams together. But admittedly, this is not a big part of our work. But I think if we look at it more from a qualitative perspective again, rather than necessarily from a data-driven one, from my perspective, the bit that makes almost all business success work comes down to relationships. Now, that is changing. Things like e-commerce is reducing the amount of human-to-human contact we have. And so it's maybe slightly less important in the future than it is today. But ultimately, especially when you look at employer experience, employee experience, employer branding, all these kinds of things, it is still very much, how is my relationship with my employer, with my co-workers, with my customers, or with my partners, all of these things. And to a greater or lesser extent, but usually greater, it's that kind of experience that defines our satisfaction with our job. I've seen numerous studies that say that almost all of our satisfaction with our job starts with our relationship with our team, whether it's with our boss, with our co-workers, with our subordinates. Do we still use that word? What's the better word? Mentees? We're not allowed to call them subordinates anymore. Our younger team members.
Team members.
Yeah. So I think it's always coming back to human relationships, right? And I think
Yeah.
this is the bit that often gets lost again. When we start talking about technology, we get lost in ones and zeros, and we forget that it's the individual human beings that
Right.
are the definers of success. I always come back to that. You know, what is the element of interaction between individuals that helps to deliver both satisfaction to the employee, but also to the customer? Because so a random example here. If you think about when you phone your bank to make a complaint, one of the things that you want first is recognition, not just resolution. You want somebody
Right.
to acknowledge the fact that the bank has messed up,
Yes.
and you want them to apologize. This is the same in a company situation as well. A lot of the time when an employee is acting up, there are emotional cues that we can pick up on that help us understand that a lot of the time they just want to feel valued, they want to be recognized as making a contribution, and often that's the sort of the trigger for behaviors that aren't necessarily the ones that the rest of the team might desire. Now, you've then got to balance that out with individual versus collective, and this is always going to come down to an individual organizational culture perspective of how much do you value the diversity of individual thoughts and behaviors versus how much do you want to create a general sense of harmony amongst everybody. And a lot of that is sort of, it's defined by a societal culture as much as by an organizational culture as well. And as we get more and more global in our perspective as businesses and as individuals, that becomes increasingly blurred and increasingly difficult to sort of define on a single basis, if you like. So I suppose those are some of the challenges, but at the same time, technology does make it a lot easier for us to integrate. So I don't know whether you have WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or similar kinds of groups with people that you work with, but even something as simple as that, making it easier to have conversations with people on a basis that they can define. So you don't need to respond immediately. You know, if you're in a meeting, then you can respond when you get out. Or if it's in the evening, you can choose whether you reply to that when you've got, you know, one of those boring moments during your show and you're like, I'll just check my messages and send a message back. You know, the individual is a little bit more in control of how and when they respond.
Right.
As employers, we need to be very careful we don't abuse that and expect people to respond 24 hours a day. But at the same time, some people just prefer to do a little bit of work later at night, go home early from the office, but then pick up again, like I said, once they put the young kids to bed or whatever else. So it seems to be increasingly coming back to flexibility. I'm sure there are other great benefits in there too, but that's one of the most important.
Yeah, definitely. And for you, Simon, is there anything you're personally excited about that's coming up in the innovation, technology, or change space, really, that either you've been looking into yourself or have just noticed?
Yeah, so I think the one that I'm enjoying most, and this has been the case for a few years now, but the ability and the opportunity to learn from my peers all the way around the world through things like social media just blows my mind. I mean, I grew up in Edinburgh, which is, you know, it's in Scotland. It's a lovely, lovely place, but it's a little bit removed, shall we say, from the hubs of the centre of the world, much as it's a great place. And I think now that I'm spending all my time on the internet, don't judge, but you know, I can speak to somebody in the building next to me right now through social media, but I'm also speaking to people so just the other day I was speaking to somebody in Mali, in Africa, speaking to people in South America, I'm speaking to people in Europe, obviously speaking to you today,
Yes.
Australia, which, you know, growing up in Edinburgh, Australia was the other side of the world. The great irony is now there's less a sense of other side of the world because we can speak to people. And best of all, even if we're not directly conversing with them, I can find your content, we can sort of share that together, but we can also learn from each other. So I find, much as my LinkedIn feed is increasingly noisy, if you're willing to spend some time sort of sifting through that, the immense diversity of perspective and knowledge and experience that you can pull out from things like that just blows my mind. I don't think that the kind of perspectives I have on the world today would have been possible 20 years ago because it's just level of opportunity wasn't there.
Yes.
I find that massively inspiring. You know, a lot of the time in the media, we talk about fake news and external governments interfering with the governmental sort of election process. Those are definitely concerning. But I find it a little bit disappointing that we don't also talk about the benefits that greater internationalization has brought us, whether it's understanding that there are all these different ways of doing seemingly straightforward tasks, and right the way through to just, you know, I mean, I can learn about ridiculously sophisticated science. I can learn about all sorts of aspects of HR governance, which, to be honest, was not my background. I started as a marketer. When I started running my own business, I had to learn HR on the job. Did a terrible job of it. All my team will tell you HR was never my strong point. But I could go onto the internet at any moment in my life and learn about, how do I do this? What does an employee benefit package look like? Wow, stress, never thought about it. So that's just wonderful. The opportunity to learn anything you care about at any time of the day from people all around the world is just wonderful. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, essentially, we would be hypocrites if we didn't agree with that statement, really.
Right.
Essentially, I was watching your content and, requested to connect, one, because it was something that you were passionate about, but also because I know there was a wealth of knowledge that you had through your experience, which is completely different to mine, but then in the same ways has very similar values. I want to probably point out of these, since we started the talk series a couple of months ago, how open and considering how busy people seem to be, they always are very open to sharing thoughts or being thought leaders on different platforms with each other. And I would have to say that some of the learnings that I've gotten just through 3 or 4 interviews is accelerated compared to, say, what I would have done in a short course even, because, I can ask the hard-hitting questions and get the answers or get the experience pretty much firsthand, or not firsthand, secondhand, and then be able to use some of that knowledge or thinking into, my next day's worth of work. So I've definitely felt the benefits of connecting with people such as yourself, and just, that really generous giving nature of your time, considering all the other things that you could be doing with your time. I'm very respectful that, that's, something that you're open to, or that you want to be a part of. And I really, really want to thank you for that.
It's quite all right. I enjoyed the same experience as you. So speaking to people around the world, I look up to my heroes and my mentors on the internet. Yes. I think one of the nice things about social is you can send them a message and ask a question. If they don't respond back, it's a lot less emotionally painful than asking face to face, right? So
true. I've had a few of those too.
Silence and tumbleweed. But I mean, it's great. That's what's nice, is that the level of rejection, if you like, is much less on the internet. If you send a message to somebody and they don't reply, it's like, oh, they didn't see it, they forgot, it's fine.
Oh, they're traveling. They just haven't got around to it yet.
Right. But like you said, the number of people that do reply, I mean, the people that I would consider my absolute heroes, getting a response back from somebody like Seth Godin, marketing legend. Right. It's just like, wow, it's amazing that you've got access to these people today, but also that they respond. And I think, you've got to be mindful, like you said, you've got to be mindful of people's time. You can't expect that people are going to drop everything to answer your very specific question. But I think where you're engaging somebody in a conversation that other people can then benefit from as well, I think that's a massively misunderstood opportunity. So Kepios as a business, the one that I run, it focuses on marketing advisory. So we get paid for giving advice to companies on how to understand technology. But we also have a policy that anybody that has a specific question that they want answering that maybe isn't part of a paid engagement, as long as they ask that question publicly and they accept the answers publicly, I'm willing to get involved in that conversation, because the more you can sort of share that conversation with the wider world, the greater the value for everybody. It helps me publicize my business, which is a good start. It helps you answer your question, but more importantly, it shares that value with more people. And I think that's what the internet is doing best at the moment, is it's distributing the value across a much greater range of people than it would have been able to do before.
Yes, true. It can be overwhelming, but it can also be a very humbling experience in one. And that was definitely one thing we were, Petra and myself, we were doing a lot of things locally to share and, I guess, network with people in this future of work space. And then we thought, well, why are we not looking to do this online? There's some thought leaders that can't come to Australia that we would love to pick their brains and connect with. And so that was sort of the reason we got into this in the first place. So again, I appreciate your time. I look forward to getting an autographed copy of that first album in 2022 at this rate.
One day.
And I'll look at them and say, oh, yes, Simon Kemp. I remember this. Unless you have an alias DJ name, I'm sure you have something really
If I did, it would be a complete secret. I'm never sharing that.
Okay. So I might just get something from someone that I don't know, but in actual fact, it's just yours.
Absolutely.
I like
this. Crossed.
Well, thank you again for your time, Simon. I will be no doubt speaking to you ongoing from this point forward. Before I finish up, though, if people who are watching this would like to get in touch with you, are there any particular socials that you prefer people to connect or follow you through?
So the easiest place is always LinkedIn. You'll find me as Simon Kemp. If you're struggling to identify which one is me, I've got the black and white photo, and the URL finishes with Eskimon.
Eskimon. I just worked out that's a combination of letters in your name, right? Because I was thinking
Correct.
Eskimo, and I was trying to pick where your Eskimo heritage was coming from, and then
it's purely an anagram of my name.
yes, still very clever. It sticks out, that's for sure. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me on the show.